Introduction. The Battle of Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the American Civil War. South Carolina demanded that the United States Army abandon its facilities in Charleston Harbor after declaring secession on December 20, 1860. The U.S. Army moved to Fort Sumter, but resupply attempts were unsuccessful. General P.G.T. Beauregard was placed in command of Confederate forces in Charleston and directed the strengthening of batteries around the harbor aimed at Fort Sumter. President Abraham Lincoln sent supply ships, which led to an ultimatum from the Confederate government for the immediate evacuation of Fort Sumter. When Major Anderson refused, the Confederates bombarded the fort from artillery batteries surrounding the harbor. Major Anderson agreed to evacuate after 34 hours. The battle resulted in support from both North and South for further military action, with Lincoln calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, resulting in 4 more Southern states joining the Confederacy. The battle is usually recognized as the first of the American Civil War. Background. In 1860, tensions are high in Charleston as South Carolina demands the surrender of federal military installations. President James Buchanan refuses, and the city is defended by 3 federal forts: Sumter, Castle Pinckney, and Fort Moultrie. Major Anderson's garrison is stationed at Fort Moultrie, but the location is indefensible against a land attack. On December 26, Anderson moves his command to the more defensible Fort Sumter. Supplies run low, and an attempt to resupply the fort is met with resistance by cadets from the citadel. Jefferson Davis orders Brig. Gen. P.G.T. Beauregard to take command of the Southern forces in Charleston, and Lincoln announces his intention to resupply Fort Sumter, which the South views as an act of war. On April 9, Davis orders Beauregard to take Fort Sumter. The next day, Anderson refuses to surrender, and the garrison's supplies will only last until April 15. Battle. On April 12, at 4:30 a.m., a signal was given when a flaming mortar shot was launched into the sky and exploded over Fort Sumter. This led to the Confederate guns in the area to start firing at the fort, which was already undermanned and undersupplied. Despite this, the garrison waited for a few hours to respond. Finally, Captain Abner Doubleday fired the first shot from the fort, but it bounced off the roof of an enemy battery. The fighting continued for nearly 36 hours, during which the fort was heavily damaged, with buildings burning and the American flag falling. Eventually, the garrison had no choice but to surrender to the Confederates. The next day, on April 13, Major Anderson and his men prepared to leave the fort. Sadly, there were casualties during the 100-gun salute, which included the death of Private Daniel Huff and another soldier being mortally wounded. Although the attack on Fort Sumter was over, the American Civil War had just begun. Aftermath. After Major Robert Anderson and his federal garrison were evacuated from Fort Sumter on the afternoon of April 14, 1861, the Confederate troops of Company B of the 1st South Carolina Artillery Battalion and a volunteer company of the Palmetto Guard, a local militia unit, took over the fort. The fort remained under Confederate control for the next 4 years until all Confederate forces evacuated Charleston on the evening of February 17, 1865. Despite having surrendered, Anderson and his men were hailed as heroes upon their arrival in New York. Captain Abner Doubleday later recalled that all the passing steamers saluted us with their steam whistles and bells, and cheer after cheer went up from the ferry boats and vessels in the harbor. Anderson's bravery during the attack and his dedication to duty were praised by the Union. Beauregard, who led the Confederate forces, was also hailed for his leadership in this first Confederate victory. He was later given orders to direct the troops at Bull Run,